Media impartiality, it's gone. It's history. It's gone the way of Prince Andrew's hairline and Observer front pages saying that if only Labour adopted a second referendum, well then they would win a landslide majority of 600, even though that's more than there are seats possibly in Parliament they could win. This evening I'm joined by Ronan Burtenshaw from Tribune, formerly Jacobin. How you doing, mate?
I'm doing well, cheers.
For people who aren't necessarily familiar with your work, who you are, who Tribune are, why should they care? Why should they read? Why should they subscribe?
Well, Tribune relaunched, obviously, last year, but it is one of the oldest left-wing publications in the country, launched in 1937 by some of the people involved at that stage in the battle against fascism in Spain, here in Britain, of course, in the Labour Party, then subsequently edited by an Aaron Bevan and by Michael Foot, was for a long time considered the kind of journal of the Labour left. And since last year, it now works with Jacobin. We did a relaunch at conference of last year, produces regular left-wing socialist, straightforwardly, as our latest cover would say, unashamedly, unabashedly socialist coverage on a daily basis online on our website, and then 4 times a year in print. So I would say people need to check us out, because the conversation we're just about to have here will illustrate how desperately you need some degree, as small as all of us, Novara, Tribune, all the rest of the left media outlets are proportionally, we need some degree of pushback, because the media landscape in this country is so incredibly rigged against not only socialism, but against the interests of working class people.
I mean, I agree with you. Obviously, we're tiny compared to Sky, BBC, Guardian, etc. But it does seem to me that something dramatic shifted in the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. The idea that we'd be having this conversation, that Jacobin would have entered the UK market, that you'd have this publication, that Jacobin would be a player behind the sort of Bernie Sanders tilt for the Democratic nomination, hopefully the White House general election here. I mean, it does feel like we're getting some momentum, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I think the media landscape reflects the landscape economically and politically. This is one of the things, right? Because I think it's worth nipping in the bud right at the start, because the second you talk, particularly here, about media bias, what you get is an avalanche of journalists saying, no one tells me what to think, I mitigate against my views, I'm not self-censoring. I remember the kind of pantomime that followed an Owen Jones piece on this not so long ago, where he simply pointed out the research by the Sutton Trust, right, which said that I think it was 50% of all journalists and 80-something% of editors were privately educated. And he pointed out that that's a problem one way or another. And instead what you got is this people who are supposed to be able to assess things from an objective and broad perspective, singling in on subjective cases, on individual examples that are exceptions to the rule, and saying, well, look, this shows. And of course it doesn't show. But it is a right-wing tactic, and it's something that they've used for a long time. If you think of, say, economics, it's the same sort of thing, where the right emphasizes microeconomics all the time. This is the dividing line between the left and the right in economics. The right emphasizes micro because it says, let's look at the small scale, let's look at individual choices. It fits with their narrative about personal responsibility. Oh, it's all a question of what this person did in this instance, and so on. And it's a conspiracy to ignore structural questions, bigger pictures, which is what macroeconomics is about. And it's the same in the media. And so what you get is this kind of narrative that says, oh, because I've not been given a kind of message, this morning from my editor to say, you must say this or you must say that therefore there's no structural biases, that therefore the media is a kind of impartial observer. That isn't the case, and there's a ton of reasons why, if you just get your head up from looking at this individual journalist's story and look at the structure of the whole thing.
Although, I mean, that's obviously true, but there are actually instances of people being told what to write. I mean, you know what I mean? We on the left will say, people, it doesn't need somebody to tell somebody else to write something for it to be, a rigged media. 1987, it's in Charles Moore's biography of Margaret Thatcher, the most recent one. 1987, Margaret Thatcher wrote the front page for the Daily Mail the day after her general election win, right? She told Sir David English, he was like, what should I put on the front page? She said, Thatcher gets historic treble, something to that effect. You've got people like David Yellen, formerly at The Sun, who's gone on record saying that, Rupert Murdoch, I saw the world through Rupert's eyes.
Yeah.
You've got former editors of the Sunday Times saying that Rupert Murdoch would, pick up the phone and scream at me if we published something which he politically disagreed with. And so even with all the stuff you're talking about, there's the unconscious bias, there's also the stuff on the record which shows a level of political interference from the billionaire class in media, which nobody should be apologising for. I mean, apologising as an apologists for. Mm-hmm. And yet they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the structural questions, right, are twofold. One is ownership, and the other is the kind of people employed by the media. So if you look at ownership, for instance, there's a very good Media Reform Coalition report on this just this year, where it had 60% of all of the newspapers read in this country are owned by two companies. They're owned by News UK, which is Rupert Murdoch, and they're owned by the Daily Mail Group. 60%. It goes up to 83% if you include Reach PLC, which is the people who own the Daily Mirror. Three companies, 83%. Now, that means that situations like you describe are very easy to happen. Because if you have somebody who has the extraordinary power of sitting on top of one of those major corporations and they have very distinct political views, well, then they can filter down what they think, not just to like one person. They filter it down through multiple newspapers, multiple days, and multiple editors. They're the ones who put the editors in place. And then the question comes, the second one, right? Because that is an important one on ownership. And media ownership is out of control in this country in terms of how concentrated it is. It's ridiculous. But it comes to then the second point. Who gets brought in? And there is that famous moment, which I would encourage everyone to look at, where Chomsky is on the BBC and he's having this discussion with Andrew Marr about the media. And Andrew Marr says, well, what do you mean? I don't self-censor. I don't self-censor. And Chomsky turns around to him and he says, I'm not saying you do. What I'm saying is if you believed something else, you wouldn't be here right now. And the point of that is that the media is a machine that picks people who conform to certain understandings of, how society works. If you're a political correspondent, you have certain degrees of kind of understanding of what politics is. And basically in this country, it means that you think that politics is what goes on in Westminster, and that you assess the ground of political opinion based on where the middle ground is in Westminster, something which is wildly out of step with any polling evidence on public opinion.
I mean, Andrew Marr's a funny one because he wrote a novel. Not many people are aware of that. I think it was a novel. I don't think it was non-fiction, which he obviously writes as well. And the launch party for it, guess where it was? 10 Downing Street. That doesn't seem like a particularly professional attitude to those in power if you're launching your book. I mean, that's obviously them doing you a favour. It doesn't seem particularly good, and it feeds into exactly what Chomsky said. We can talk more generally about, but so this evening's show, for those who aren't necessarily familiar, who didn't see this great thumbnail, which was knocked up by Fox earlier on, which is not just about media impartiality, it's about these documents which were released by Labour yesterday, the unredacted dossier about US-UK trading negotiations. Finally, we'll end up on some stuff about polling, which I think is actually not as bad as people probably think. But let's stick, for now, probably the first third to half of the show on media bias. I want to move quickly to the BBC, because I think most people would agree with what we're saying. Left or right, they would say, yeah, you know what, print media is rigged. Billionaires own all these big newspapers, the Barclay brothers, Murdoch, fourth Viscount Rothermere in the case of the Metro and the Daily Mail on Sunday. But something weird has happened with the BBC in the last few days. Do you think the gloves have come off with the BBC in the last week since the polls started to close?
Look, it's a difficult thing because I think that what's been going on at the BBC has been happening for a long time. And the question of whether something changed or not in the last few days is always hard to know. And in these instances, if you go and say, absolutely, I do think that, then what will happen pretty simply is they'll come back and, falsify and say, well, no, here is where, we have been, here's our document on, say, for instance, the topics we're covering the last few days. Here's our discussions on bias, and are we tilting one way or the other too much, and so on. And the BBC produced these kind of quite in-depth guidelines for themselves, and they've been made public for this election, which people can go and read. You just Google BBC election guidelines, you'll find them. But the problem is that it is evident to anybody who is looking at the BBC's content in recent days, whether it be the tax article and headline, which was outrageous, the idea that because of one tangential tax in terms of the marriage tax, which, let us be totally frank about this, is nothing to do with how much you earn. That tax is in place for a simple reason, because it wants to prioritize and give favor to people who are married,
it's discriminatory,
to the exclusion of people who aren't. Now, my parents aren't married. I'm at least a third of people I know's parents aren't married. On what basis should we be saying that those people are discriminated against?
But also, they see marriage as like a central part of building social cohesion into a society. What kind of institution is it if people are getting married because of a tax break?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Jesus, we've got a 50% divorce rate. I mean, that's not going to help, is it?
And it produces the kind of anomalies that actually people who, say, for instance, are really invested in the institution of marriage should be unhappy with, like people getting married deliberately to try and avail of tax breaks. It had nothing to do with the question of whether people earn under 80,000 or over are going to be paying more tax in real terms, because when you're talking to people about the question of, okay, am I going to pay more tax under a Labour government? And you're saying people under 80,000, what people are thinking of is questions like, is there going to be income tax increases? Is it going to be that the people who are in my position are going to be paying for this in some kind of very substantial way? They're not thinking about something that is on the side, which is a marriage tax, which in the first instance is very specific, and people can only
and what are the numbers involved,
it's 250 quid or something was the one that was brought up, right? Now, people can go, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so people can go and look at that.
I'd heard that, yeah.
But it's, this is not a substantial point. And to say, which is how the BBC headline framed it, was that basically Labour's whole claim that people under 80,000 are not going to end up paying for their programme was false because of this one very anomalous incident that had nothing to do with major taxation, was so ridiculous. And it really skewed the whole debate about taxation in Tories' favour. And of course, immediately they put it out. It was sent around social media hundreds, thousands of times by people who are arguing the Tory case, saying, look, even the BBC says your taxes are going to go up. And of course, they're not. The point, and you can debate Labour's economic plans, right? We were just talking off air there before about Scandinavia. Right. It is certainly true that in order to achieve the kind of social equality that they've gotten in Scandinavia, there's a much broader tax base. And that people who are earning less are paying more taxes, right? They get a great return for that. Their quality of life is much higher, but that's the case.
Yeah.
That is not Labour's plan. Labour's plan is very focused. You're taxing people in the very top percentages, 5% in the income bracket, and to some degree people's wealth and business wealth, in order to pay for a social
financial
democratic
transactions, etc.
Yes, exactly. In order to pay for a social democratic program. That's Labour's plan, and any earnest economist would tell you that's what it is, right?
And the IFS conceded that today. For whatever criticisms they had elsewhere, Paul Johnson was saying this fundamentally is no more extensive state intervention than what they have in Germany. I think that was, basically what he was saying.
That's partly because I think it was the Resolution Foundation came out with that viral graphic, which was absolutely true, which is saying even at the most kind of extreme estimates of how much Labour want to spend, they'd still be miles behind not only the Scandinavian countries, but a lot of Central European countries in terms of proportionate GDP and public spending, right? So this is not a radical programme, but crucially for the BBC headline, it is a programme that is paid for by concentrated taxation on the wealthy. And that headline gave anyone who saw it past their timeline today, it gave them the impression that wasn't true. That added to Laura Kuenssberg's assessment of the NHS documents yesterday.
Well, let me go through these. So if we can just get these up, folks. The first one is this gentleman tweeting. What was this? There was Instagram, right? We haven't got the screen today, so I can't see, but I'll work off what Fox says. Is it up, Fox? The Instagram stories, yeah. Which did you see these?
Yeah, I did. So a series of stories put out on BBC. I think it was the BBC Stories Instagram page.
That's right.
I have to be totally honest. I'm one of those old fogies who
it's really new.
I don't even have a personal Instagram page. Tribune does though, and you can go and follow it. But what it had on it was straightforward. What it was in the final day of voter registration, you had a series of stories which talked about how politics was boring, how the campaign was uninteresting, things that were meant, you could only really, for whoever put them together, have been thinking, oh, this is young people not interested in politics. Whereas the evidence was showing massive voter registration and on a really unusual level of youth engagement in the election. So to put that kind of stuff out, you have to ask questions. And the problem you get in these situations is it is possible. And I'd say to people at home, don't always assume in the first instance that the worst answer. It is possible that one of these things, or two of these things, or three of these things are mistakes. But when all the mistakes are happening and going in one direction, then, of course, serious questions have to be answered. And the most serious one of those, which I'm sure you're going to bring up now, is the Andrew Neil situation, which is incredible. If it is true, which Labour have said...
I mean, I've been told that. I presume you have as well.
That they were told that BBC had agreed interviews with all the leaders. And that wasn't true. That is an incredible untruth to put forward in the middle of an election campaign.
I'd say people should be fired, but I mean, that is probably a firing offence.
I don't know. I mean,
if they've knowingly misled a leader of the opposition, and it could be it's obviously undermining the impartiality of the BBC, and it could be a game-changing event in the election. Probably won't be, but it could be. I mean, that really, I can't imagine many lower things that an employee of a public service broadcaster could do than to actively mislead a politician during a general election.
Yeah, look, I think it's really bad. Because if it is the case that BBC put forward someone who they themselves say is their hardest interviewer, is the person who really skewers the politicians and all of those things that they themselves say, and one political leader who could be Prime Minister gets it and the other doesn't, and you've told the person who went on beforehand that there would be equal treatment, I think that's a really serious problem for the BBC. And I think it is serious enough that they're going to try very hard to turn it around. I think they're going to try very hard to get Boris Johnson on with Andrew Neil, because otherwise, I mean, people are going to talk about this after the election.
Well, the Tories have offered up Johnson to do Mar on a Sunday.
No, it's not the same. Unless the BBC put together an interview on the same format as Andrew Neil and Jeremy Corbyn, they're going to be in trouble after the election. And I think they know it enough that they will try very hard to turn that around. But, what I was saying in the BBC is it would be a mistake for us to look at things too narrowly. Like, there is a big structural question which has gone back a long way with the BBC. And it goes back to things like in the late 1980s when John Birt was brought in.
John Birt being?
As Director General. And basically what it was is the Thatcher government felt that the BBC was stacked full of trendy lefty types and not favourable enough to their agenda. And serious reforms were begun on the nature of the BBC. And really the question comes down to this. Is the BBC a state broadcaster or is it a public broadcaster? And that has always been a tension in the organisation. And actually, if you look at broadcasters around the world that are publicly owned, that is always a tension, right? And the BBC always had a very considerable element of what it did, which was state broadcasting. And what I mean by that is basically you're broadcasting out to the population on behalf of the state.
Yeah. It's royal coverage, for instance.
Whereas on the idea of a public broadcaster is really the reverse, that you're speaking on behalf of the public to power, right? So your whole perspective of things is different. In politics, this is really clear. Are you mainly projecting the views of Westminster out to the broader public, spending almost all of your political time dealing with the controversies of Westminster? Or are you taking the issues where there's overwhelming public consensus against the government and against Westminster in general, and taking those questions to the government? Which way is your emphasis? And in general, I think it would be very difficult for people to honestly say that the public broadcasting side of that equation, the one which holds power to account on behalf of the people, is stronger in the BBC. I mean, if you have a thought experiment, if you get something like a consensus across the parties in Westminster, in their leaderships, over key questions, say, for instance, whether migration policies are racist, which was kind of there for quite a long time, right before Corbyn came in. Even if you get, a kind of pretty strong objective assessment about the degree of suffering that people are facing, the fact that the hostile environment was being created and so on. If there is a consensus in Westminster around it, what degree do you think the dissent that's out there in the public to that policy will feature in BBC's political coverage? Very, very little. If you take, for instance, nationalisations and public ownership, right? These are, I think, really, really strong ones. Well, we've known now since before Jeremy Corbyn, actually, right, that there isn't just support for renationalising rail, mail, energy, water. There's unbelievable, overwhelming public support.
It's the consensus.
70%, 80%,
Yeah.
Poll after poll after poll, year after year after year. And yet it was off the agenda until somebody came into Jeremy Corbyn's position and reflected it. So the media didn't put it, and particularly the BBC, didn't put it on the agenda because they were reflecting the views of Westminster to the public rather than the public's views to Westminster. And so that battle, right, over state versus public broadcaster is important. And there's a history here at the BBC, which is BBC has always had those two souls, right? Part of it is a state broadcaster, and you see that really clearly in, say, foreign policy, where the assumption is always that the British state is acting more or less legitimately or in good faith. So when things go wrong, say for instance even the likes of Yemen and so on, it's usually, oh well, we mucked that up. Do they really know what they did? The plan has gone a bit wrong here. And that was the same characteristic of their coverage of Iraq. There was one particular incident where the BBC stood up to the Blair government, and I'll come to that in a minute, which was good. But in general, their coverage of foreign policy is very much state broadcaster. But BBC historically has produced an awful lot of very, very good television. It produced an awful lot of very good coverage politically, which was done more on behalf of the public. But that idea of public service was so good during the Thatcher years that, of course, they were going to come for the BBC as an institution. And Tony Benn talked about this and the effects of it after it happened in the 80s and 90s and what it meant. And the kind of what we would call on the left neoliberal reforms that we saw at the BBC produced a situation that when the BBC were cutting people, like I think when they sacked 6,000 people in the 2000s in one very famous incident, they came out afterwards and said, we're determined to show the public that we're a value for money organisation. The whole logic of the thing had turned into, we are giving these things to consumers rather than we're here to fight and represent on behalf of the public. And then there were key moments along the way in that kind of trajectory, one of which was in 2010 when you had Mark Thompson, who was then the Director General, going into Downing Street, meeting with the leading figures in the government, Andy Coulson and so on at the time.
Criminal, as we now know, criminal Andy Coulson. Yeah,
to discuss the coverage, the BBC's coverage of austerity. And when he was going in, and people can go and Google this story if they want, because it does sound incredible, but it's true. He was photographed with a briefing note from Coulson about how the BBC had been too negative in their coverage of the government's austerity and not been fair, effectively, on covering austerity. Now, why does that happen? Well, it's a structural reason. It's not because of this, in my view, this individual baddie or that individual baddie.
I mean, they exist as well, but the explanation is
it's about the fact that the BBC is formally accountable to the government. Its leading people are appointed by the government, and it has to go through this regular battle over funding with the government. And so you end up with an organisation, particularly after long-term Tory governments, and where you get a public service broadcaster behaving a lot more like a state broadcaster, because they effectively know that the people who run the state have them a bit over a barrel. And one example of that, another important one, was 2015, right after the unexpected Tory majority. The Director General of the BBC goes in and has a week-long meeting over the future of the organisation in a panic. because they'd been hoping that Labour's kind of more pro-funding position would win. And he negotiated a little bit of bits and pieces here and there of extra funding, and mostly things being frozen. But what we now see, which is the over 75s TV licence, he negotiated, right, that would be on the table, that the BBC would have to chase that themselves instead of that coming through the government, which is, as he then later described, I think as recently as last year, that was nuclear for the BBC, because that put them in a perennial chase after...
It's cost hundreds of millions,
yes,
right?
A perennial chase after their own tail and funding. And so then you've got an organisation which is more and more and more cap in hand to not just the government of the day, but the state and the advisors to those governments and so on. And it's no surprise that structural situation produces the kind of stuff we're seeing in the BBC.
I mean, added to that, with those cuts, I mean, John McDonnell said this put it really well maybe 2 weeks ago here. You see increasingly the central role for the paper review on the BBC.
Yes.
So fewer and fewer people are reading newspapers.
Yes.
Right, that's just a statistical fact. You know, the readership of like The Sun, The Times, The Telegraph is about a third of what it was 20 years ago. Right. Some of them have big online reach, like the Mail Online. Some don't, like The Sun, like The Express. Telegraph, I think its profits fell 94% last year. It's running a slight profit, but it doesn't seem like it's really got a viable model. The Times probably does, right? And what you see from the Today programme first thing in the morning is, the front pages say this. The day after the Andrew Neil interview with Jeremy Corbyn, which we could talk about maybe later, but we haven't got time, I don't think it was that bad because there wasn't a 45-second clip which would just decide the election, which is what they wanted. Yeah. That would be the sort of the jackpot for the Tories. Didn't happen. And then the next day, The Sun are calling Jeremy Corbyn a racist on their front page. And it's being read by Nick Robinson at 6:09 or whatever. And the BBC's Royal Charter explicitly states that it offers an understanding and analysis you won't find anywhere else, as well as being impartial. And yet, more often than not, increasingly with the central role of print media, even though that's on the decline, actually they're just replicating the frames and agendas of print media. So on the Today programme, on the paper review shows, the day that we had the Sunday Telegraph, the Mail on Sunday, the Sun on Sunday, all run the £1.2 trillion story, the day before on the Saturday evening, the two people reviewing it, who are they? I don't know, one person from the left, apparently. They had the political editor from The Sun, was the other person. So the political editor of The Sun is basically saying, yes, this $1.2 trillion pound story, which has been concocted by Number 10 in liaison with these newspapers, is a really important story. You think, why is a public service broadcaster doing this? And as John said, when you cut that many people, you're going to have to do more paper reviews, more journalism.
Yes.
And it's kind of like you say, it's like this Ouroboros, the snake that eats itself. And I don't know where it really ends, because it's coming to a point now where there is no public service in the journalism they're doing, increasingly at the top end.
Well, if we accept, right, and the vast majority of the public does, that the concentrated ownership of private media is a problem. And it's not just, as I said, 60% of all the newspapers that people read in a day owned by 2 companies, 83% owned by 3. But it's also online, where 5 companies have about 80% of the market. So you add in to Daily Mail Group and News UK, Reach PLC is the 3rd company that has a lot of print, and then the 2 online ones, The Guardian and Telegraph, right? So that's an astounding level of concentration of media ownership. And what is the BBC for, if not to be a kind of bulwark against that? To serve the public as an institution that is state-owned, publicly owned, and therefore is not subject to the same whims of some billionaire owner. And the problem is that right now, when you have a situation where the print media, as you've just described, are doing the agenda setting, their headlines and their investigations, their whatever stories that they've come up with, are what is kicking you off every morning and saying this is what sets the agenda for the day. Well, then you are not doing the job of kind of pushing back against the ridiculous billionaire control of our media. What you're doing is just providing another outlet to relay those opinions.
They're amplifying it. And they're a megaphone for it.
Which is cannot be in any kind of sensible understanding what public service broadcasting is about.
A great example of this was, I wrote an article about this on the BBC, I think, end of last week maybe. Great example was Stephen Nolan on 5 Live somebody calls in and says, actually, I think Jeremy Corbyn's genre of leadership would go down very well on the world stage. He's a listener. People are like, oh, we're not used to British prime ministers being like that. And Stephen Nolan apparently not apparently, I heard him. Stephen Nolan just says, well, look at the front pages tomorrow. How can you possibly think that? Nobody will take him seriously. Look at the front pages. You go, this is not on a sort of objective metric by which we should judge a prime minister.
Let's have a look at those front pages. I think it's really important. And it's important to ground ourselves in the evidence, because if you don't, what they'll end up doing is coming at you and simply saying, this is traditional lefty bashing in the media, whatever. Loughborough University produced a study for the start of this election campaign. I think it's their Centre for Culture and Communication, it's called. And you can go and find that online. If you search Loughborough University and Labour in the election, you'll find it. And they looked at all of the stories in the first part of the campaign that had the Tories or Labour covered in them. In fact, I had all the parties. I just had the information for the Tories and Labour in front of me. And they gave a plus point if the story was positive and a minus point if the story was negative. And the Tories in that survey from the start of this campaign from the print media got 4, +4 was their number. Labour, do you know the number?
It was in the -8, 7,
minus 91.
-91, all right.
-91. So you can go and find that online in Loughborough. You can see what their methodology was. That is the distinction with the print media. You have in the beginning of the election campaign, academic research showing that the print media is giving, yes, it's marginal, +4 positive coverage to the Tories, -91 to the Labour Party. And then our public service broadcaster is taking all their headlines and recycling them every morning.
Well, it's also the +4 probably isn't even, that sounds like maybe, okay, well, that's fair. But when you think that Boris Johnson in 2006 wrote a story saying Iran should have nuclear weapons,
yeah,
right, in the Telegraph. Can you imagine if that was Jeremy Corbyn? Mm-hmm. Nobody's talked about it in the whole election. Boris Johnson isn't. Actually, we can have a conversation about nuclear. I'm not. I probably wouldn't say that's the worst thing he's ever said. Not that Iran should have nuclear weapons, but it's certainly a heterodox thing for somebody on the right to say. But that's completely at odds with their message on defence and security policy, and yet nobody's even mentioned it. Let's move on. Before we do, just to sort of confirm the point, Fox, if we could get up that tweet from Rob Burley. It was an amazing tweet, the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And he said, we've made all the front pages. We didn't make the Daily Mirror, but obviously in Burley land, and the BBC, on the BBC right, that doesn't really count. That to me struck me as like the apotheosis of this kind of thinking. We've made the front pages. Wow. It's like, you reach far more people than like the Dead Tree Press.
Yeah.
But why do you think he was so gratified by that? Is it a cultural logic?
Yeah, it's an influence question, I think. The BBC is proud that it has the level of influence that it does with its coverage of things like elections. And I think you're looking at that and saying, if you're in his position, we've had a really influential interview, we've skewered this political leader, everyone is covering it, and we've, kind of given the public more information. But of course, the whole question, right, and this is the difficulty, is that as I was talking about at the start, no one wants to look at structural questions. I've been a journalist for a long time. I was a rep for the NUJ. I get this debate. I've had it over and over and over again, and I'm exhausted by it. Where people say to me, "Oh, there isn't bias because I'm not going in there and deliberately doing this XYZ." But if you're asking the question, right? Well, what are the major issues? And we have polling data on this that people are concerned about in this election. And you choose to spend a third of your interview discussing the anti-Semitism situation. You should be called to account as a public service broadcaster.
It was 12 minutes of 30, right?
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, so slightly over a third, yeah?
Yeah.
And then you're asking the question, right? Well, if you're a public service broadcaster and the evidence is really amply available what people are concerned about in this election, yes, you could have said we'd spend a third of it on Brexit because Brexit comes very high, and that would have been tough for Corbyn too. But you spend a third of it on the anti-Semitism scandal. And for what? With what justification? And then
it's to get that 40-second clip, right?
Then you come into the real question, which is, well, what are the implicit biases that people have that lead them to decide certain things? Because I don't care who you are in the media, right, left, whatever. Like, if there is no article you ever put together, no political broadcast you put together that is entirely outside the realm of ideology, belief, and whatever. Because even if you're only deciding to report in totally factual terms that X happened at Y place at Z time. Why are you reporting that thing? Why have you chosen that thing to report? That in itself is a question of political choice. So,
or the omission of stuff, right?
Yeah,
so for
which
instance,
is far more relevant.
So like Ian Duncan Smith having paint, smeared on his wall about austerity is appalling, but nobody mentions 72-year-old Labour canvassers, one having broken ribs, one having a broken jaw. That's not been talked about by the BBC. So yeah,
I agree. I think that there's another problem, right, as well here. In my view, and I would say this right or left, and I understand it's easy in one sense to come back at this if you're a working journalist and say, oh, well, you're a lefty and whatever. On the one hand, I would say what Tribune does by saying we are unashamedly socialist allows people to read our coverage and say, okay, this is the perspective it's coming from, and we understand that. And so it's a lot more honest than going out there and pretending you exist in a world outside of politics, which is always fakery. It's always an act of fakery. One of the things that I think, even for those people, right, who believe the journalism works this way, that should have precipitated a crisis for them, was the Robbie Gibb situation. You have somebody who is in overall charge of BBC's political communications, right, in overall charge of their programming. Somebody who was a previous chief of staff to a shadow chancellor who was the Tories, and who effectively ran the Portillo leadership campaign.
Yeah.
Now, on what basis does somebody like that become, if you really do believe that you're operating in a, like Laura Kuenssberg said, in a situation where, we would die in a ditch for our impartiality, on what basis does someone like that become the head of your political programming?
And his brother's a Tory MP as well, Nick Gibb.
And then he goes on afterwards, inevitably, to become the communications director at Number 10. Now, that should precipitate a massive crisis of people saying, look, we've had somebody who's been overseeing our political coverage who has now gone and become literally from supposedly, the hen or whatever to becoming the fox. This is a major problem, right? This gives us a real sense that what we're doing here is not politically impartial, but that we've got people with very clear agendas who are behind our political programming. And nothing. No one seemed to think that was a remarkable thing. And I understand why, because there is this history of porous, or however you want to say it, revolving door between the BBC and politics. But that in itself is a problem as well. If you really believe that you're being impartial, and a lot of people in there really believe it, well, then how is that not a major crisis?
Well, here's the thing. Novara's. I saw in the comments some people say, well, Novara's not impartial. We never claim to be. We have an about page. We're very explicit about our values, socialists, internationalists. We understand the major challenges of the 21st century. We're very clear about, we would never have an editorial in support of Jeremy Corbyn. We don't operate like that, but it's quite clear who we would like to win the general election and so on. And like you say, I think it was Peter Hitchens once, and they said, what's the one thing you would do to improve the BBC? He said, just make everybody be honest about their political commitments.
Yes. Well, this
That's
is the
one thing you could do to improve the service overnight.
I agree, because like I said, in these arguments I've had for a long time with people, you get kind of two solutions presented to you. One is we're going to go for really perfect impartiality, right? Which doesn't work. What you can do, though, is have good processes in place that try to take a realistic perspective of what the public opinion is. Orient yourselves as a public broadcaster, not as a state one, that is reporting on behalf of the public and asking the questions of those in power on behalf of the public, not sitting around in bars in Westminster and making friends with MPs and relaying their opinions. But the other thing is, that there's that meme a few years ago that went around the American political scene, and it was funny, right? This idea that, like NASCAR drivers, all the senators should have to wear their sponsors and their donors on their gear, on their get up every time they go into the Senate, right? Okay, I'm not suggesting that, but let's be a bit honest about
why not? Why not? Andrew Neil could do that. If you actually look at his register of interests, it's 100 times bigger than anybody else at the BBC.
But everybody also knows what the situation is. I mean, this is the other thing that I find amazing in this country, partly because, say, in Ireland, where I come from originally, there is a somewhat different situation. Not to say that the media, it doesn't have its own horses that it backs, but there isn't such a clear divide in terms of, well, everyone knows who this paper backs. Everyone knows where the Sun is going. Everyone knows where the Mail is going. Everyone knows what the Telegraph believes. Everyone knows the Guardian. Everyone knows the Mirror. There is if you want to talk about what's a conspiracy, is a conspiracy of nonsense about impartiality, where we're all supposed to pretend that these media outlets, where you can, in 3 minutes on Google, see what political positions they've taken in every previous election, are somehow to be believed to be impartial. I mean, it is an absurd situation, right? So let's just say outright, right, that if people are coming in and they have those views, and say, for instance, Robbie Gibb comes in, having been a long-standing Tory, having worked for the party, that he comes in and he's heading up BBC's political coverage. Okay, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea, but okay. Then he has to be held to account for how much he's countering his own biases and giving more space to left-wing opinion, to opinion that's outside the box on the left. He has to be seen to be doing that. Otherwise, you are just being like dishonest with people.
You're a journalist. You've been a journalist for a long time. Would you ever, something I'll answer after you, so I'm not putting you on the spot. Given that revolving door, would you ever work for a Labour politician? Say Jeremy Corbyn becomes number 10, he ends number 10 as the Prime Minister. Would you become a press secretary or
head of communications? First of all, do I think that they would ever ask me? No.
No, but in the abstract.
Yeah. In the abstract, yes. And I would, because I've done it before. I've worked in politics before. I've worked in the Irish Parliament. So I've done it before. But I've always, so when I was writing things, right from the very, very beginning, I wore as a badge what perspective I was coming from. And people in like early on when I was jobbing journalist, when I was doing freelance stuff and whatever, my editors, knowing what perspective I came from, would put pressure on me. So I remember writing pieces about the housing crisis and being told that I had, I couldn't just talk to the tenants who were being screwed over by the landlords, but I had to actually go and speak to the Property Owners Association and get their view and whatever. And that's fine. That's fair. Because they knew what perspective I was coming at things from. Right? I would have no problem if that was taken forward, if people were going out there and saying, like Tribune does, on our front page in our latest issue, that we're socialist. Because that is allowing people to take the information that we give them and subject it to their own critical analysis. When you go out and you say, we're impartial, and you're owned by a right-wing billionaire, and everybody knows what political view your leading staff have, everyone knows who you're endorsing in the election, and some of your leading people are in like very good friends with leading figures in the Conservative Party, well, then you are lying to people. So I agree. Let's aim for honesty. People want to try and make the impartiality thing work and come up with good structures, great. But as a start, let's just have people being a bit more honest and not having a kind of ridiculous situation where a long-term Tory staffer ends up running BBC's political programming, then runs off to do the communications for number 10, and everyone's like, yeah, that's how it works, we're still impartial. Who is going to buy that?
Well, here's another one with the Andrew Neil, Jeremy Corbyn interview. Boris Johnson, former editor of The Spectator. Who's the chairman of The Spectator? Andrew Neil. Who owns The Spectator? The Barclays brothers, who also own The Telegraph and The Sunday Telegraph, billionaire tax dodgers who have their own private island. That is just unbelievable. Like, if you put that in Russia, if you say Vladimir Putin is going to be interviewed, and Vladimir Putin worked this organization, and the chairman of that organization is the gentleman who's going to interview him, and the people that own the publication, The Spectator equivalent in Russia, are, multi-billionaires. Oh, and by the way, the transcript from the entire interview can now be read online on The Spectator. I mean, on what planet does anybody think that's remotely normal? And I think it's one of those things that's a useful thought experiment. If you think about that interview and you think about the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was misled into thinking that Boris Johnson was going to do it, and that was a lie, that to me is, it's reminiscent of politics in a country which isn't a democracy. And maybe it's something we'll finish on. But increasingly, I look at the media, and it's not one it's a managed democracy. It's like Russia, which is to say you still have the elections, you still have, regular terms, etc. But something very sinister and strange is happening.
I wanted to put it out there, right? Because, not that I suspect we're going to have very many right-wing views tonight, but let's just put it out there that the system and the way the media is structured. I mean, my own view is that obviously we're in a case now where there's a general election, and for the first time, 2017 this time, so second time, we have no major media outlet who reliably backs the leader of the opposition. So that is an incredible situation to end up in. It very rarely happens, and it's because there is a kind of politico-media nexus which is constantly policing the bounds of acceptable opinion and very rarely allows people who are outside in. But we do have one here, and it is a situation, right, where Jeremy Corbyn doesn't have somebody who's a reliable supporter, who's, the Mirror and the Guardian. The Mirror is kind of centre left, the Guardian liberal left. They've given supportive coverage. They've got some very good people working for them. But I think we all know if they were given a choice tomorrow, would they replace the Labour leader? Both their leaderships would say yes.
But that isn't new. So like in 2010, the Guardian backed the Lib Dems over Gordon Brown.
Agreed, yeah.
The Daily Mirror was they actually backed him, but they were kind of ambivalent about him.
Yes.
So actually, we're on the fourth election now, post-Blair. This is a really like long-term structural question we now have to ask ourselves about the Labour Party moving left because of a crisis of our economy, a crisis of political legitimacy that's going to carry on, whoever's the leader after Jeremy Corbyn, whenever that happens. And 4 elections since 2010, and like you say, there's not really been a major media outlet which is going to go, balls to the wall, sorry for the French, for the leader of the party.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that the key question here, right, is if that is the case, that there are reasons why. The structural reason is that the left, broadly speaking, and the policies put forward in Corbyn's manifesto evidence this, are trying to improve the lives of people who've got actually quite little in terms of wealth. So if you've got a country, right, where you've got 10% of the population owning 50 to 60% of the wealth, these people empowered to project their views through the media by simply buying and owning media. And then you're the BBC and you're sitting between a left, which is representing, by and large, or they're attempting to represent. I know the culture war is changing things to some degree, but attempting to represent and putting forward positions that are good for the majority of people who own very little property, against people putting forward views from the right who are extremely well funded, and they're well funded because class still matters, because they represent the capitalist class, because they represent a small portion of our society who owns the vast majority of the wealth. And now if you're sitting in the middle between those two and you're saying, well, on the one hand, we have 60% of all the newspapers people are reading every day owned by the billionaires behind the Daily Mail Group and behind News UK, which is Murdoch. 60% of the newspapers just there. And on the other hand, you've got a Labour leader supported by effectively none of the newspaper owners. Maybe our job is not to sit there and pretend this is a fair fight. The referee analogy is used all the time. But I would also say this, because I know, as I was coming up to at the start, that there's inevitable right-wing criticisms you get to the lines we're putting forward here. So let me just ask, do people also believe that, say, for instance, under Harold Wilson, when you had an attempt by Cecil King, a major media mogul, to depose a sitting Labour Prime Minister, do people on the right also think that that is, in favour of someone else inside the Labour Party, that is good, that somebody, if a Labour government gets elected, that the person who, say, owns Reach PLC and has the Mirror behind them should be able to have that much power? Do they believe that when Tony Blair, right, when he was going to try to get elected, he flew out to Australia to meet Murdoch, and then Murdoch backed him in the elections? Now, if you're on the right and you think that's, perfectly good and sensible situation, I mean, maybe you do because you've got a more realpolitik view of things and you understand your side does a lot better when the game is a bit fixed like this than our side does. But it's obviously wrong and it's obviously unfair.
I mean, realpolitik is one way of putting it, but I think also increasingly centre-right politics, its default is anti-democratic. That's not just in Britain, that's around the world. And you look at politicians like Ted Heath, Harold Macmillan. They had even a Churchill, who was a racist, a bigot, etc., that shared experience of World War, colonial overseer, etc., but that shared experience of World War clearly was some kind of a cement after World War II, after World War I, in terms of quelling down. There were great class antagonisms because there were high rates of industrial action, etc., but there wasn't this hatred, this enmity now, which the ruling class have for working class people, they utterly despise them. If they couldn't exist, they'd get rid of them. And I think that's increasingly the default, like I say, for centre-right politics. And I think it's quite new. I mean, I really do think it's since the mid-'70s, and it's clearly growing. I think Paul Mason, we had him on the show maybe a month ago to talk about his book. People slag off old Paul sometimes because, he makes big claims. But the thing with somebody who makes big claims, like he talks about, the collapse of the neoliberal self becoming the fertile breeding ground for fascism Mark II, is I think you make big claims. Sometimes they have an analytical clarity which other people lack. And I think this is what we're talking about. And I'm not saying if the Tories win a majority on December 13th, we're no longer a democracy. But it does feel like this is ebbing into something really dark. And this election has brought it out. And I think they're burying their teeth, not just in print, but also in the BBC, because you actually have an anti-system alternative. And that's what it took. If Jeremy Corbyn does nothing else, it's revealed, actually, the surface level veneer we have for impartiality and fair play in the media.
Yeah. So if we're going to do whatever, meta-narratives, is that the kind of the approach we're taking here? If we're going to do big picture questions, right? Well, then my view is it can only ever really be a veneer, the right's perspective on democracy. If you exist in something that at least is a formal democracy, and you represent the parts of society that have massive concentrated wealth, and on the other side, there's a ton of working people who live by their wages and who are empowered every now and again to get a vote to change things. You cannot possibly allow a fair game, because if there was one, I mean, like that argument that Marx made, in his belief, which was, it would be too simple to say he totally believed this, but he felt, that democracy and the broadening of the franchise would inexorably lead to the rise of the socialist movement, because people would be empowered to, take control and vote for redistribution of wealth, which by anyone's standards, should happen. It didn't happen. And one of the reasons it didn't is because the democratic game is very carefully policed, and the institutions that police it are things like the media. And so I think it's always been a veneer, the degree to which the right really respects democracy. There's a very good book by Corey Robin, the American academic, where he looks back at this in the history of conservative thought and so on. And it has been a very, very long war against democracy. The other thing I would say, of course, as an Irishman, I bring this up, but when you get capitalist crisis, what happens is the practices that have been on the periphery migrate home. So in the immediate post-war period, the British centre-right may have looked like they had a more communitarian perspective in Britain, but you wouldn't have thought that if you lived in Kenya. You wouldn't have thought that if you lived in Belfast.
Iran.
Yeah.
Burma, yeah.
Exactly. And then what happens now, one of the reasons this is a very important election, when we're talking about, say, international stuff, you were saying earlier on about the caller in, talking about Jeremy Corbyn, his stature on the international stage. It is an international election. It's an election of international significance. And the reason for that is that we've gone through this long period now, a decade-long period, where the capitalist system has not been able to restore a model of shared prosperity, of sustainable growth. What we've had is, like in Britain, you've got the longest wage stagnation since Victorian times. You've got anemic growth, and you've got an economy which seems across the West to be more and more focused in on finance, tech, pharma, and a kind of, base outside of that that's very, very thin. Huge numbers of people working in terrible zero-hour, low-paid jobs in hospitality and retail. And these are big employers. And so what you've got is a system, right, which is in a 10-year-long crisis, effectively. It didn't end when the recession ended. It's still in it because they haven't found a new model of prosperity. They haven't broken through. And it's going to be resolved, this crisis, one way or the other. It's going to be resolved by the right and this new right, which is emerging all over the world, and which, by the way, I mean, I remember being active in 2014 and 2015 and thinking to myself that we were better positioned to gain from this crisis than the right. Ever since then, it's been an absolute rout. The right have gained place after place after place. They've gained as an outside right, winning, anti-establishment campaigns, and they've won over the main parties, the right parties. So, and in some cases they've done it in both, right? So in Spain, they both managed to get Casado in as the head of Partido Popular and take things more right, and they came through with Vox, right? Where you've got, now they didn't manage to win that last election, but Vox are a massive influence now, and
the third biggest party.
Yeah, an unreformed fascist party, basically, right? Now you could make a case about saying, well, they're not attacking democracy and whatever, but they're embracing so much of Franco's legacy that everybody knows the unsaid thing in every sentence when they say Franco was great is we should get rid of this democracy, which they believe was built by this conspiracy of lefties who tore down Spain's greatness. So the right has made these great gains. And ultimately, this crisis, because capitalism is an international system, ultimately it's resolved on the left or on the right. If Labour lose this, it has huge international significance. If the Tories win a big majority and Boris Johnson gets to veer off in a right-wing direction with his friends and Viktor Orban and Donald Trump and whatever, it has huge significance. And similar with the American election next year. If Bernie Sanders makes a breakthrough, there's a real possibility that you can consolidate and grow a left-wing alternative and that the crisis will break left. But this crisis right now looks like it's breaking right. And Labour are trying very, very hard as one of the few international examples of somebody trying to provide an alternative from the left.
I think it's important for people to be watching. People who are watching, you can have a left-wing party do sublimely in Catalonia or Sweden. But the reality is, like you say, if this crisis to break left, you're going to need left-wing parties, leaders, ideas becoming hegemonic in 2 or 3 major powers, realistically. And
there's a whole moment here.
The implications of what happened on December 12th go far beyond these shores.
They do, because this is like the Corbyn moment. It was tied in to what was happening in Greece with Syriza, and when people knew it happened with Podemos. So there's a whole kind of post-2012 stretch for the left, right, where the left migrated from being very concentrated on social movements and so on, the Occupy moment, all the rest of it, into trying to compete for political power and winning the state. And it did it through the rise of Syriza in Greece, Podemos' emergence from Quincem in Spain, Corbyn winning the leadership of the Labour Party, then Mélenchon's campaign 2017. There's a whole kind of stretch of these. Corbyn and Bernie are kind of the last two standing. If they both get beaten, then we're into a new phase of the left, and there'll be all kinds of very interesting debates to follow this about whether people continue emphasizing the party, which, as Tribune editor from Tribune's history and give my own politics, I think we should continue trying to fight this line, but better, or whether people are going to return to social movement orientations. People are going to believe, as was the popular belief in like 2009, 2010, that mainstream politics, we can't really do much through it. We have to try and influence it elsewhere. It is one of the flaws of the Corbyn project, I would say, that we haven't seen at the same time a big increase in kind of class struggle that has happened at the same time. We just haven't.
We have a little bit.
Not to the scale.
The CWU now is quite...
which is great. And
yeah.
The CWU thing
is a socialist union. They're having this... Yeah. They had industrial action recently, which was literally outlawed by a court. A huge turnout.
And we should give them solidarity
and
today
because
the courts have come up against
them
again.
I think people don't realise what a low level we were starting at. So you look at the CWU, the Postal Workers Union. You look at the UCU strikes last year and the increase they saw in membership. You look at the Fire Brigades Union rejoining the Labour Party, having a level of public voice after Grenfell they probably wouldn't have had. They would have been browbeaten by the Tories if there hadn't been like a stronger general left, both in and outside the Labour Party. It's not perfect.
But
you look at
teaching
unions.
I would encourage people to go and look at things like days lost to strike action in the 1970s and now. Now, you can have upticks and so forth. You can, but there's a reality here, which is the class game has changed massively. And one of the things you would hope for would be the Corbyn moment would produce another way. We haven't really seen it.
I'd agree with that, but in sort of response to the argument from the social movement types, they view it as a zero-sum game, and if people are doing party politics, it means this stuff is neglected. Yes, and the reality is actually two of the most interesting industrial actions of the last decade in this country have both happened alongside.
Yes, I agree totally with that. That's true. Yeah,
becoming ascendant within the Labour Party. So
yeah,
I think that's a false interpretation to say, it's a zero-sum game. Anyway, we're going to have to move on. Before we do, we're going to go to some questions shortly. I mean, we've only, you know what, we were always only going to talk about the media on the show tonight. You're watching, or perhaps even listening, if it's on iTunes or through SoundCloud. Tiski-san, my name's Aaron Bastani. I'm joined this evening by Ronan Burtenshaw. If you like what you're watching or listening to, why not subscribe? Go to support.novaramedia.com, make a one-off payment or an ongoing subscription. We advise, or we ask for, or we hope for the equivalent of an hour's wage. So if you're on minimum wage, maybe pay that, maybe don't if you can't make ends meet, obviously. If you're earning £20 an hour, we would hope you could perhaps afford that. Otherwise, we've got right now 1,915 people watching, but only 286 likes. So we want a lot more likes. Hit the thumbs button, please. And also, if the hashtag BBC Impartiality, if that's still going on Twitter, why not share this show on the hashtag and say the BBC has all sorts of problems. We need more people like Tribune and Novara Media breaking through into the mainstream. We'd really appreciate it. Right. We're going to probably just not talk about the Labour announcement yesterday on the US-UK trade negotiations. What I would say is we have a video probably coming out tomorrow, if not Monday, with two doctors looking at those documents, why they matter, and why, yes, the UK is looking at privatising the NHS and opening up to US business after a very likely no-deal Brexit, if the documents are meant to be believed. What we will touch upon briefly before going to questions is the polling. Very briefly, 5 minutes. Yesterday, 10 o'clock, Sunday Times and YouGov put out this poll which gave the Tories a majority of around, well, it's saying the high 60s, but it had gone down from 100 at the weekend to 68 yesterday. So let's say it's 50 to 60 on present data. What did you make of that?
Look, I think we are facing an uphill battle, but that's the story of the left. You know, it's very, very rare that we get ourselves in a situation, given what we just talked about, the kind of structural obstacles we have before we win things. You know, we were saying earlier on about the CWU, right? And the CWU got an absolutely outrageous mandate for their strike. 97% yes on a, whatever it was, 76% turnout, I think. And the courts just said no. These are the kind of obstacles the left faces day in, day out. The media, the courts, the way that the legal framework is, the fact that, say, for instance, in a Christmas election, you know, how many of our people who we need to vote for us are working terrible shifts on December 12th? Terrible, miserable Christmas shifts, and they've been working them for a week, and they don't want to go out and vote. There are all kinds of big structural problems against us, but we're still in the game. I mean, what that poll shows is that if the trends continue for the rest of the election, Labour has a good chance at taking a Tory party, a Tory government, which was once again trumpeted as impossible to defeat, and reducing them to either minority government or hung parliament, which opens the door to all kinds of abilities to us, to whether Labour are in, whether the Tories have to rely on support and whatever, from other parties. It opens the door to all kinds of potential to put pressure on and stop the worst parts of the Boris Johnson agenda. So every fraction of a % of vote that goes to Labour between here and the election day is huge. I mean, every extra person who turns out in a marginal is potentially the person who stops the next round of the reforms that lead to a fit to work, that lead to a bedroom tax, that leads to, you know, austerity policies, which, as we know, have killed thousands of people in this country.
Yeah.
So my take on it, if you want to, like, the objective assessment, my view is that methodology, when it was applied in 2017, was much closer to the election. It has some merits, probably more than most polling, but there's very little evidence of the last decade that polling companies are that much more reliable than economists when it comes to forecasting.
I mean, here's the thing. So it probably isn't right because there's a margin of error, etc. Even they make, you know, there's lots of caveats which are made by YouGov themselves. But I think it's really useful for the left to just presume it's right, because all the seats it's talking about, the Tories winning, primarily Brexit seats, Grimsby, Mansfield, forget the bellwethers like Mansfield, Grimsby, Bolsover. And I think we have to presume that that's correct. But what I think we need to take succour from is that you're looking at about 80 seats, which according to that data right now would be won by the Tories. There's a 6% difference between Labour and the Tories. And if that 6% in those 80 seats are flipped in the next 2 weeks, Labour are the next government. Now, is that inevitable? No. Is that likely or probable? I personally think it's likely, but probability is a big claim. That's my view, because I would say, well, if the next 2 weeks are like the last week, yes. In which case you have a Labour-led government, you have Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. And that you're talking about basically 50 to 100,000 votes. All of a sudden, it looks like a US election where you're looking at Pennsylvania and Ohio, and that's going to swing it. That's basically what these 60 to 80 seats are. And so people are going to get downhearted about that. What I found really amazing was it said that the Tories win the popular vote by 11%. But if that's, and actually other people like Comrades have said actually their poll from the day before was at 7%. Comrades had the Tories on 41, Labour on 34. For YouGov's model, if that is the case, then it's a hung parliament. So actually the sort of what constitutes success here is actually surprisingly low. You know, the Tories could win the popular vote by 7% and it's still a hung parliament. And so, you know, I'm really optimistic, but it's not false hope. You know, people are going to have to work their asses off, because the next 2 weeks, in terms of media coverage, in terms of kickback, you know, if the polls close even further, it's going to get a lot worse.
This is the thing, right? If you had said to people out there a couple of weeks out from an election where you can vote to increase minimum wage, tear down the anti-union laws, properly renationalise the NHS, have a Green New Deal, deal with the real problems in housing and build 1 million council houses. Yeah. If you told people we're a couple of weeks away and we're in the game and all this can be achieved, it's like people would bite your hands off for that.
Yeah.
And I know as a you know, long-time leftist, if you told me that you could have somebody who is like a couple of weeks out from that election, who's in the game, where it's really possible that you have a socialist who could change the whole debate of the economy, not just in Britain, but across the West, who could really meaningfully take on the interests that are tearing apart the societies. And all that needs to happen is in the last 2 weeks, people put everything into it and we fight a good campaign. And then it could happen. I would have bitten your hands off for it. I mean, but the fact that this project, after 4 years of all the obstacles that we faced, is still in the fight is remarkable.
Well, I think
people should take courage from it.
I think if Labour get more than 35, which I think they will get more than, I think they get 35% tomorrow. If Labour get more than 35%, bear in mind Labour won a general election in 2005 on 35%. Yeah. That would have been 2 elections where Corbyn's got more than Blair in 2005, Brown and Miliband, despite everything. And people are saying, we'll go to questions in a sec, please put the rocket emoji next to them. Somebody said, you know, nobody wants a hung parliament. I don't want a hung parliament. But a coalition, not including the Lib Dems, I think could be brilliant. I honestly think it could be brilliant because it brings in the SNP who would help push constitutional reform over the line.
Here's what I would do in a minority government situation. I wouldn't even go for a coalition in the first place. What I would do if I was Labour in a minority government situation, and this is why people who like Labour's manifesto should not be worried about it. It'll come with problems. I'm not going to deny that. Also some within the PLP. But here's what you try and do with it. You take your massively popular policies, increase the minimum wage, housing, renationalising rail, mail, energy, water. You put them down on the table and you dare that parliament to vote against them. And you build popular support for your project on the basis of the fact that you're going to have Liberal Democrats and Tories and whomever else in that parliament trying to vote down that legislation. And I tell you what will happen is, even with all the media attacks, on things where Labour have such a clear mandate to improve the lives of people, those parties are going to find it hard to frustrate it. They're going to find it hard to frustrate the renationalisation agenda. They're going to find it really hard in the minimum wage thing. After the longest stagnation in wages in this country since Victorian times, they're going to have to come out and say, if Labour put down a bill, no, we don't want that. We don't want an increased minimum wage. Okay, let them say it. And let everyone in the country see them say it. And take a massive loudspeaker and say they've done it.
I agree. But what I would say is, because I think it's going to be a hung parliament, What I would say is you want that majority, you want the magic number of whatever it is, 326, without the Lib Dems, ideally, I think. Because I think they're just going to be awful. So between Plaid, the Greens, the SNP and Labour, it's almost like if the obviously there's some great Scottish Labour MPs. I think we've had Paul on before from Glasgow. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Paul Sweeney. I obviously want him to win. But if it's the SNP that take all those seats off the Tories in Scotland, it's great news, right? Mm-hmm. So, I don't see such a bad picture in terms of that poll, and I agree with you. Actually, hung Parliament, I think, it isn't as bad as we might think for Labour.
This is going to be a very long struggle. Like, this is my perspective. Go out there and you fight for every vote in this election, because the difference between the number of Tory seats and number of Labour seats is literally the difference between life and death for working class people. So you fight for every vote. That being said, this is going to be hard no matter what the outcome is. If you end up with a massive Labour majority, the Labour leadership will still have to deal with a substantial part of the Parliamentary Labour Party who do not want the programme to pass.
Who are to the right of the SNP or Plaid or the Greens.
So it's going to be hard no matter the situation. Yeah. If you're going to try and take on the vested interest in this country, the extraordinarily concentrated wealth and the political power it has, then you're going to be in a struggle. It's going to be a long one either way. So you can't be afraid of whatever's coming around the corner and the outcomes. What you can do is go out in an election period when we have the opportunity that just doesn't exist in the intervening years, when the press are systematically misinforming people about what Labour stands for, what Jeremy Corbyn stands for and whatever. When we have a very particular opportunity to go out there and people are switched on to politics and listening, and we have a programme that represents their interests, we've got to take advantage of it and go and fight for every last vote, and then say at the end of it we make our assessments, but we're not afraid of the fact that there could be struggles around the corner with a minority government, a hung parliament and whatever. Yeah.
Right. We're going to do 5 to 10 minutes of questions. We've been very ill-disciplined this evening. However, we've got more than 2,000 people watching, which is great. We've had about £100 through the super chats, which is amazing. Thank you to Alan, who gave us 76 quid. I mean, that's brilliant. Just to say, every single penny is helping us to really step up. We've got a great new studio. We've got all this new equipment. We're in Bermondsey, central London. I won't get
Aaron's new shirts,
My new shirt. This is actually this is from Uniqlo. So people shouldn't get any false ideas about me wasting money on shirts. So yeah, it all helps. Thank you so much. And if you want to add to that, go to support.novaramedia.com. So questions by the rocket emojis. I'm taking them. Let's see. I guess the first one is, and I saw it asked earlier, did Labour make a mistake in backing a second referendum?
If people read Tribune, they know my view on this. So I wrote a piece with the kind of ambiguous title of "Hold the Line" after the Euro elections, because I anticipated that there were, the culture war side of Brexit has a real problem for Labour. Like, the Labour Party, if it's going to fight as a class party going forward, it has to be trying to fight on the basis of people's interests and improving their lives. If politics gets realigned on kind of American style lines, where you've got people with liberal social views against people with conservative social views, which is mostly where they were trying to push the Brexit debate, then the worry is for Labour that you turn into a Democratic Party style thing with no space for working class people, no space for unions and so forth. So I was really worried about that for the long term structurally. I'm worried about it in this election too. Labour were in a bind on it. It was very hard because you're losing votes, I think, both ways. But I wouldn't have made the concessions on the Brexit question leadership did. I think there is a chance we pay for it in the north, in Wales and so on in the election. But fingers crossed we won't, because the other side of it is, if we really allow Brexit to determine our future here, the Brexit issue to determine the whole future of the Corbyn project, I think it would be a massive mistake. There's a great case to be made to all of those people who are like long-term Labour voters in the north of England, in Wales particularly, who are thinking now of turning to Tories on the basis of Brexit and saying, what have these people ever done for the places you live in, the communities you're from? What have they ever done for your kids? What have they ever done for you? What have they ever done for the public services you rely on? What about the buses in your area and the cuts to that? What about the cuts to local councils? What about the queues outside job centres of people who can't, who are dealing with an absolutely draconian system that is forcing people to the point of suicide in cases like Fit for Work. What about all of that? And I think if we make that case strongly, we can win people regardless of the Brexit issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think the position that's been taken by Labour is a strong one. I didn't agree with it initially, but increasingly, when you look at the sort of trajectory of what's happening with Brexit under the Tories, I think, and also it's really key that Jeremy Corbyn's neutral. If they had this policy, but Jeremy Corbyn said, we're going to back Remain, I think it would be a profoundly undemocratic policy, and I think it would rightly upset enough people that they would be, despite everything you just said, which I agree with, they wouldn't vote for Labour. I think it's a decent policy. I think, and given the situation, given the conditions, I think it's probably the best one we could imagine. Any more questions? Let's see. One was, should Jo Swinson resign as leader of the Liberal Democrats?
Well, thankfully, that's not a decision that I have to worry about very much as somebody who's not...
Do you think she... Okay, will she? Let's say right now, that Times YouGov poll yesterday gave them an increase of 1, but obviously in real terms, they would lose 8 because they're presently on 21 because of defections. Do you think she would then have to resign after that?
Look, I think that the Lib Dems are in a position where the kind of politics they represent is difficult to find compelling people to put forward as a leader. It is possible that there's a kind of palace coup with Davey, and I know he has a considerable kind of support base still who are frustrated that he lost out to Jo Swinson. But honestly, other than that, who are they going to put forward? So I don't know. I mean, I don't think the Lib Dems are going to do fantastically well in this election. I worry that they haven't fallen back to 2017 levels yet. I think there is a real battle on for people to try to convince Liberal Democrat voters who have voted, people who are leaning Lib Dem now, who voted Labour in 2017, who voted Labour in 2015, who don't like austerity, who are not fans of fracking lobbyists and whatever else, to get out there and make the case, that Labour represents a far better version of the future than the Lib Dems do. So I think it's really, that is really worth doing either way. And a straight answer, does she resign afterwards? No, she tries to hold on, I think, even if they don't do great, and may have a chance of doing so because the alternatives are so poor.
Best way to hold the BBC to account, from Andy Madeley.
We need a much bolder attempt at media reform. And the media reform thing should not be, because of course, when we talk about this, what will be the first thing everyone will say? You want to use the state to make the BBC echo your views. That's not the case. Actually, what would be in the interests of public service broadcasting in general is a far more independent structure of the BBC, where it is not so cap in hand to government, is ring-fenced funding, that it can be guaranteed is not going to be put on the chopping block when it pisses off the Tories. Take, for instance, tonight what's happened with Channel 4 and the climate debate, where the Tories have come out and expressly said, you are mean to us, we're now going to review your public service provisions. That's straightforward. I mean, that's you can't be any more clear about how you're using public service broadcasting than what they've just said. If we don't approve of what you're doing, we will threaten to defund you. That situation has to be removed for the interests of the public in general. BBC should have a much better structure in terms of accountability that has more people, if it's going to be a public service broadcaster, not a state broadcaster, that has more ordinary people, really, as part of it, who are putting pressure on them. And then you've also got to ask the question of where people come from, where its staff are coming from. And the processes of hiring have to be thrown open there because, as we've just said, it is evident that the kind of people who are rising to leading positions, certainly in their political coverage, have a very narrow, particular worldview that in many cases doesn't reflect public opinion. So I think we need a bolder media reform agenda in the Labour Party. I would encourage people to read the work of Tom Mills, Dan Hine and so forth, who've looked into some of this. I think we need a much bolder media reform argument, but the big structural things can be dealt with. We can say to the BBC, that we're going to make real difference in terms of their independence by not forcing them into chasing their tail over the licence fee, and by not having such clear responsibility to government of its leading figures.
So, final question. It's two questions I've put into one, basically. Mm-hmm. Firstly, would Corbyn in power increase the likelihood of a united Ireland? be as quick as possible with that one. And then secondly, what's the state of the Irish left right now?
I think it's a very complicated one, the first one. I mean, I wouldn't give a clear answer on it, because I think the problems you're going to get, people underestimate the degree to which there is significant opposition, even in the labour movement in this country, to a unity referendum and so on. And again, there are structural reasons for that. So I don't know what the outcome is. My own view on the unity question, obviously I'm a supporter of it, but I think it has to be a particular kind of campaign, and I do worry a little bit about the campaign that's shaping up there. I mean, I'm not wildly interested in winning over unionist big business interests simply because they're annoyed at Brexit. That's to me not the idea of a socialist republic that James Connolly fought for. If we're going to have an Irish unity referendum, I think it has to be not just stitching together two broken states and creating a 32 county tax haven. It has to be actually fighting for a fundamentally different society in Ireland, a new republic, and it has to be led by a popular movement. And I hope that's what develops. I don't know if it will be. The state of the Irish left right now, I'm going to get it in the neck from people for if I criticise things having fecked off. But I think it's a very difficult position. I was involved in, the water movement, which was a real high point for the Irish left historically. We were getting hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets in Dublin multiple times in a year in a southern state of 4.4 million. Incredible numbers. And the hard truth for everyone involved, all the parties, all the unions, all the figures, is that momentum was not consolidated. Things went backwards for the left. I think Ireland is in a difficult spot. Sinn Féin is the biggest left party and has a lot of good left-wing people and so forth, but not a very ambitious platform, in my view. I may have got more ambitious at the last Ardèche, but in terms of the manifesto and so forth, not a very ambitious platform. And a lot of people in its leadership are concerned about fighting a unity referendum, which means that they don't piss off too many people. They don't piss off too many, particularly business interests, and holding events with, liberal business people in the south arguing that we could have great economics in a 32 county Ireland because we'd simply extend the tax haven and have tax mutualisation, as they call it.
This is the Sinn Féin position, right? On corporation tax.
Yeah, you see the Sinn Féin as
harmonisation with North and South.
This is the thing, right? So Sinn Féin sort of and sort of don't. They're trying to ride two horses here, because in the south they're a sizable party with a working class base, which was the biggest beneficiary of the austerity years in terms of left-wing politics. Yeah. In the north, they're a cross-class nationalist party with millionaire newspaper owners as their mayors or previously and so forth. Like it's very hard to be both of those things. Yeah. And so, yes, they're in favour of tax harmonisation. I mean, that's in the documents. It's absolutely
right now,
clear.
Corporation
12.5%. Right. And by the way, no one pays it. This is the other thing you're going to hear here as well in corporation tax. People say, 25%, 20%. Ignore the headline numbers. No one pays it. Go and look at the loopholes that are put in place for corporation tax, and it will drive you insane. The number of companies based in Ireland who pay 0.1% of their tax in corporation tax because of these loopholes is insane. So, I think Sinn Féin, for that reason, they didn't do well in the Euros and local elections, which just happened there. They lost some very good people, who, for instance, as MEPs and so forth. I think they're in a difficult spot. I think the Irish left in general, there's been a bit of a turn to the right, but there's a fundamental thing, which is the nature of the Irish economy. You've got this ring of people doing very well out of the tax haven situation, which, being frank, is what we have. I know a lot of people dispute it, but it's ridiculous. It's a tax haven. You've got a ring of finance, pharma, tech, legal and accountancy doing very well. And then you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people locked out of that prosperity. Our headline GDP numbers are a farce because they count all of these companies that are letterboxes in Dublin as Irish companies, which is a nonsense. The actual truth is the Irish economy is very uneven, is open to whatever the next economic crash comes, very open to it because of the situation that we have in terms of being reliant on foreign direct investment. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who can't afford decent places to live, who are stuck on jobs that pay them too little, who are reliant on terrible public services. By the way, one good reason not to allow the Tories get their way with your NHS, the average cost is 70 quid every time you go to the GP in Ireland. That's what it's like. Now imagine if you're somebody who's struggling on the bread line, you have to pay that. What happens is people just don't go and they get sicker. That's what happens when you don't have a proper public health system. So there's huge numbers of people in Ireland getting screwed over by the status quo, and my view, standard kind of Marxist view, is eventually those structural problems will replicate themselves in politics and we'll have another left-wing upsurge.
You've been brilliant. We went over significantly tonight, but it was a great chat. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I believe we're having a show tomorrow night with Michael Walker, Ash Sarkar, maybe somebody else too. My name's Aaron Bastani. You've been great. This is Tiski Sauer. We'll see you tomorrow.